Devastated cities, millions of refugees, tens of thousands.
It's been over 4 years since the full-scale war in Ukraine broke out. The war isn't just a conflict between two countries. It became the largest war in Europe since World War II, reshaping military alliances, economies, and the future of an entire continent. And while the fighting continues today, history tells us that every war eventually ends. The real question is, what happens next? After years of fighting, the front lines have changed surprisingly little. Although recent news reports came out with Ukraine hitting the Russian core with drone attacks and possibly shifting the tide in its favor, the battlefield has mostly remained the same. It's looking like neither side is willing to throw in the towel anytime soon. But the war will eventually end. Whatever its outcome ends up being, Ukraine and Europe as a whole will change forever. Thus, I'd like to explore the 4 possible outcomes of the Russo-Ukrainian War and how its consequences will shape Ukraine's future. The first scenario is the simplest, and perhaps the most tragic. Nothing changes. In this outcome, the war of attrition as we know it today continues for many more years to come. Despite the numerous harsh sanctions implemented against Russia by the West, the country was able to adapt and focus its economy on its growing state military-industrial complex. Russia has continued to be an energy exporter. At the same time, to replace the trade deficits with Europe, they've increased their trade with China, Iran, and North Korea, which has made Russia very capable at waging war against Ukraine at a stable rate. As things currently stand, neither side in the war is able to make a breakthrough, despite the Russian government's best efforts in trying to sell the invasion of Ukraine as some great patriotic fight against Nazism and saving the Russian-speaking populace against Ukrainian tyranny. Morale in Russia has relatively remained low. Its main conscripts consist of economically disenfranchised people from the provinces and minority communities who, instead of fighting for the glory of the motherland, are waging war for a paycheck. Large-scale mobilization remains unpopular within the country. The vast majority of Russians, although supporting the war, are against mass mobilization. As things stand, Russia has suffered heavy casualties with over 1 million soldiers killed or injured. Similarly to the rest of the developed world and transitional economies, the country suffers with its demographic picture. Since 1993, the nation's population has been in decline. Its fertility rate is well below the replacement level at 1.4 children per woman. Throwing even more of its citizens into the meat grinder would only make things worse, further weakening its economy, ability to provide social services, and leave the country more vulnerable in case of another military conflict. At the same time, Ukraine's demographic and economic situation is much grimmer. In 1991, Ukraine's population numbered 51 million. However, in 2023, it was estimated to be 33 million, dropping 1/3 in 3 decades. Meanwhile, its fertility rate is 1.1 births per woman. Millions of Ukrainians have fled abroad with the eruption of this conflict. This, alongside the vast destruction of its infrastructure and industry by Russia, has made the country's economy extremely vulnerable. As a result, Ukraine's capabilities to defend itself are heavily reliant on the support of its NATO allies. Even though Russia is still sustaining higher casualties on the battlefield, theoretically, it could opt to continue waging a war of attrition. Based on numbers alone, this strategy favors Russia as Ukraine can't keep up the same level of resistance over time due to its resource limitations. Even so, if the forever war scenario comes to fruition, Ukraine would transition into trying to balance its resources on fighting and rebuilding at the same time as we're seeing happening now. Emigration from the country would continue. Its economy and welfare system, as a result, would be particularly in danger, with funding for social services being redirected to its defense. This would make its pensioners and war veterans especially vulnerable, as the state wouldn't be able to sufficiently pay them out. The living standard in Ukraine would eventually decline as its society becomes exhausted. the country would become increasingly more reliant on Western support. If Russia's frequency of attacks were to continue at the same level, lifting martial law and holding elections would become very unlikely. The country would be stuck in limbo. This could become extremely problematic for Ukraine as political nuance would slowly deteriorate. Economic hardship could slow reforms and increase opportunities for corruption and political instability. And in the worst case scenario, civil war. Even if the intensity of attacks were to decrease and resemble somewhat of a situation that two were found between 2015 and 2021, the situation would still go in Russia's favor. The conflict would keep Ukraine out of the EU and NATO, de facto reluctantly putting the nation under Russia's influence. The Kremlin would seek to hold the status quo until the Ukrainian leadership was exchanged with another that would be more willing to make concessions. Essentially, we'd have a repeat of the Georgian situation with the country stuck in perpetual conflict for decades until a lesser hardliner would concede to Russian interests. A saving grace in this scenario would be a change in Russian leadership. Either Putin dying or the government somehow ousting him and replacing him with a more moderate leader. Naming his policy regarding the war would be a complete speculation with no real way of knowing. Meanwhile, Ukraine wouldn't lose overnight. It would slowly bleed economically, demographically, and politically. The next scenario is the frozen conflict case. In this outcome, Russia and Ukraine come to some sort of truce that ends most of the fighting, but do not come up with any proper peace deal. The frontline as we know it freezes with Russia staying in control of 20% of Ukraine's territory. Neither Ukraine nor the West recognize these lands as a part of Russia, but they de facto become such. Militarization of both sides continues. Both sides would pour in tremendous resources in fortifying and arming their sides on the front line. Ukraine's military spending would continue to take out a large chunk of its GDP. Because of past events like the Minsk agreements, Ukraine would expect Russia to violate the truce at some point in the future, as it did in 2022, and launch another invasion. Russia, on the other hand, would use Ukraine's militarization as a propaganda tool, arguing that Ukraine is arming itself in preparation to attack the Federation, which in turn would lead to Russia also stationing more soldiers and fortifications on its borders. The situation in the region would be akin to one in Korea, both sides in an arms race with occasional provocations and border skirmishes. Although better than a continuous war waging on for years with no end in sight, the atmosphere in Ukraine would still be quite bleak. A truce as is would be an extremely hard sell to the public. Morale to keep on defending the country is still high in Ukraine. Additionally, much of the public would see the deaths of hundreds of thousands of its countrymen for naught. As such, accepting the current state of the borders would be extremely unpopular and would very likely destabilize the country. It's very possible that a variety of different investigations would be launched against Zelenskyy and his cabinet when it comes to the handling of the war and some notorious events such as why the country wasn't prepared better for the invasion, why Mariupol wasn't evacuated, how come the Russians were able to take over Kherson so quickly in the beginning, and how did the former energy minister escape his arrest for embezzlement, to name a few. In the soon-to-be elections after the truce is declared, Zelenskyy would most likely lose. In the last days in cabinet, it's likely that the ruling administration would focus on protecting themselves against the war-handling investigations. Public anger could fuel the rise of extremist nationalist parties potentially led by war veterans who witnessed the horrors of war firsthand. Already General Valery Zaluzhny, the commander of the armed forces, garnered a decent amount of popularity before being replaced in 2024. Another figure to look out for would be Vitaly Klitschko, who served as a popular opposition leader in the country prior to the full-blown invasion. It's even possible that the West would be blamed for not helping out enough, which could garner some Euroscepticism and in turn strengthen Russia's narrative. But the vast majority of the blame would still be put on Russia. When it comes to Ukraine's economy, things wouldn't be looking that much better. Although the country's economy will see some growth with no more active fighting taking place, public spending on defense would still remain high. This in turn would funnel resources away from other public goods like education, healthcare, and transportation infrastructure. Foreign investors would still be wary of bringing their capital into the country out of fears of another invasion sometime in the future. All of this in turn would contribute to more people leaving the country due to worsening conditions, which would just snowball and worsen Ukraine's economic recovery even more. The west of Ukraine would lead its politics and economy, as most of the people who remain in the country or choose to come back would most likely resettle there due to its geographic security. The east, on the other hand, would see increased emigration and far less investment due to its proximity to Russia. One of the biggest determining factors in this scenario would be the West's position on both countries. Whether or not Europe and America would continue to supply Ukraine with weapons and equipment, on what scale, and whether or not sanctions would be lifted on Russia. As I mentioned before, the vast majority of Ukraine's fighting capabilities come from the support of its allies. To develop its security in preparation of another attack, the West would need to increase its supplies to the country. The United States under the Trump administration has not been the most reliable partner going back and forth when it comes to its security guarantees. So to combat this, Europe would need to take a more proactive role in Ukraine's defense. Depending on the truce's terms and Europe's appetite for expanding its influence, we could see European peacekeeping troops stationed in Ukraine similarly to the situation in Bosnia or Kosovo. It's also uncertain what the West's policy regarding Russia would be. Even though hard Russian allies like Hungary's Viktor Orban are no longer active in deciding the EU's policy on the war, we could still expect some countries, like Slovakia, to lift some sanctions and reinstate trade with Russia. Despite the EU taking a nominally hard stance against the country, the Union still continues to import gas from Russia 4 years after the war. 13% of all natural gas is supplied by them. Although the bloc agreed to cease all imports by 2027, we could see a return by at least some countries to this source of energy due to it being cheaper. Germany under Merkel took a more lax approach to Russia, arguing that economic reliance on the country would deter it from future conflict. Even after the invasion of Crimea in 2014, construction on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline continued, and the West gladly participated in the 2018 World Cup in Sochi, Russia. A renewed trade with the country would dictate its capabilities of waging war in Ukraine in the future, and in turn, Ukraine's defense buildup. Joining the EU on its single market would be of tremendous help to Ukraine's financial situation. It's possible that in this scenario, we also see an expedited process of Ukraine joining the Union. However, we could also see the opposite. The EU has not been able to come to a consensus regarding accepting new members. The Western Balkans have been waiting for almost 2 decades to join. Some politicians within the EU have argued that this would be unfair for them, as Ukraine still has a very long way to go in battling corruption and implementing reforms. This battle would be even more difficult if its economy and living standard remain low due to increased spending in anticipation of another attack. In many ways, a frozen conflict would be the worst of both worlds. The bombs may stop falling, but Ukraine would still be forced to prepare for the next invasion while trying to rebuild from the last one. Billions would continue flowing into defense instead of schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. Investors would remain cautious, refugees would hesitate to return, and politics would continue to revolve around national security. The war would no longer dominate headlines, but would remain shaping every aspect of Ukrainian society. The third scenario would be Ukraine's victory. In this outcome, Ukraine is able to make a breakthrough on the front line, pushing all the way to its pre-2022 borders. In an extremely optimistic scenario, it's able to restore control over all of its territory it controlled before 2014. This ending would be extremely reliant on 2 factors: increased Western support and Russian destabilization. As I mentioned before, Ukraine's ability to fight is highly reliant on the supplies its allies provide. Currently, both Russia and Ukraine are stuck in a stalemate that slightly favors Russia. At the moment, Ukraine is mobilizing 30,000 people monthly, while Russia is recruiting roughly 30 to 40,000. To tip the scales on the front, Ukraine would need to be supplied with a greater quantity and more technologically superior weapons than its opponent. As the war is heavily relying on drone and missile warfare, air defense systems like the Patriot system and the SPAAGs are of crucial importance. Drones and rockets are the #1 cause of casualties for Ukrainian personnel and civilians. To keep up a numerical advantage and high morale, Ukraine would need more defensive equipment. But war isn't just won by defending, one must also go on the attack. To make a successful breakthrough, Ukraine would also need to be supplied with more long-range missiles, artillery, fighter jets, and most importantly of all, drones. As noted in the beginning of the video, the average Russian's desire to wage war against Ukraine is quite low, but at the same time, their desire to oppose it is also meager. This is mainly due to the fact that Russia's civilians have not majorly felt the effects of war back home. Their everyday life is more or less the same, be it their government bombing Kyiv or not. To make a successful breakthrough on the front, Ukraine would need to increase its attacks against targets deep inside Russia, especially in its tier 1 cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg. Developing an indigenous long-range strike capability could be especially effective, as Ukraine would be able to respond proportionally to Russian attacks on its own cities, which could potentially make the Russian government rethink terrorizing Ukrainian residential neighborhoods with missiles. Bringing the fighting back home would make many Russians second-guess the regime's decision to keep fighting. Targeting its refineries, ports, and energetic industry would also decrease its effectiveness in fighting this war, which could potentially lead to Ukraine achieving a breakthrough on the front and Russia being forced to accept a peace treaty in Ukraine's favor. Some analysts are starting to believe the scenario could prove true, as for most of this summer in 2026, Ukraine has amped up its attacks on Russian infrastructure in Crimea and the mainland, skyrocketing fuel prices, increasing inflation, and causing many Russians to flee. Many journalists have also reported on rising discontent in the government in Russia over these attacks and the changing rhetoric in how the Kremlin has been reporting on its war. If arms keep flowing to Ukraine and the country is able to keep up attacking the Russian core, we could potentially see a Ukrainian victory. We've seen a similar scenario play out in Yugoslavia, although the Yugoslav war machine seemed unstoppable on its own in Bosnia and Kosovo. After NATO's direct intervention and extensive bombing campaign on Serbia, morale in the country plummeted as its industry, economy, and effects of war could be felt in Belgrade. This led to mass protests and revolution that subsequently ended the war and overthrew Milosevic. It's unlikely that the same scenario would play out in Russia, as mass discontent hasn't deterred the Kremlin against its war efforts so far, but more pressure on the Russian public could play in Ukraine's favor. If Ukraine were able to restore its borders to the pre-2022 level, the country in Europe as a whole would receive a giant morale boost. The country could gain confidence to keep on pushing to restore its jurisdiction to pre-2014 levels. Millions of refugees would most likely return back home, although we'd probably see less return to ex-occupied areas out of fear from another future conflict. The West could see the country's victory as promising potential and expedite Ukraine's membership in the EU and NATO while showering it with security guarantees. All in all, the country would most likely go through a construction boom as investors from abroad would flock like never before. The country's tourism industry would also very probably see a drastic increase as millions were exposed to Ukraine for years via the coverage over its war. Zelenskyy and his administration would be seen as heroes in the West, and his approval ratings would most likely improve back home. Questions of how effectively the war was handled would still remain, but unlike in the previous scenarios, the public could be much more lax regarding prosecuting or even investigating the administration, as it did defeat one of the world's greatest military powers as an underdog. But the country's problems wouldn't disappear overnight. The weapons Ukraine procured wouldn't come for free. The nation would be left with a decent financial debt it would be forced to pay off. Its demographics would still remain bleak, even in the most optimistic case, assuming restoration of the 1991 borders and rapid economic recovery. The population is on track to decline to 31 million by 2035, even with refugees returning. It's uncertain how the country would tackle this problem, but we could see increased austerity, Ukraine debasing its currency and potentially selling off a good chunk of its industry and natural resources to foreign actors, as is the case with the Ukraine-US Mineral Resources Agreement. Another major issue would be the leftover mines. As it currently stands, mines and other explosives affect around 29% of the country's territory and 10% of its agricultural land. Demining would continue to be a major challenge the country would struggle with for decades, similarly in fashion to Bosnia and Cambodia. Several farmers would get injured annually while tending their fields. Despite all the challenges, this would undoubtedly be Ukraine's most optimistic future. Victory would not erase the demographic crisis, heal the trauma of war, or rebuild destroyed cities overnight. But for the first time since 2022, Ukraine's future would no longer be defined by its survival. Instead, the country's greatest challenge would become rebuilding itself economically, politically, and socially. Winning the war would not be the end of Ukraine's struggle, but it would finally give the Ukrainians the opportunity to shape their own future rather than simply fight for it. The final scenario is the one Ukraine and its allies have spent years trying to prevent: a Russian victory. In this eventuality, Russia is the one who makes a breakthrough on the front line. Ukraine's armed forces are defeated, and Moscow's military is able to march into Kyiv and enforce its peace conditions. For this to happen, the West's support for Ukraine dwindles or stops altogether. The US administration under Trump deems supporting the country more trouble than it's worth. The EU is either unable to provide weaponry or stuck in an administration gridlock again due to the emergence of a new Orban-like figure. Either way, Ukraine would have to not be able to procure weapons and equipment from its allies, which would eventually lead them to be overpowered by Russia's domestic military-industrial complex. In Russia's advance across Ukraine, we'd see a massive caravan of refugees fleeing the country or going to western Ukraine. A new humanitarian catastrophe would emerge, and Europe would struggle in managing such an event. Ukraine's government would likely face an unprecedented legitimacy crisis and tremendously weaken. We could see a lot of its elites and oligarchs also fleeing the country, leaving massive power vacuums in the remaining fragile government. That's not to say that the country as a whole would just lay on its back and let the Russians roll all over them. Resistance against Russian occupiers would continue, but it would become much more decentralized. It's very likely that guerrilla fighting would become prominent, with smaller Ukrainian forces trying to catch Russian ones off guard. Many Ukrainians would willingly or unwillingly turn to collaborating with the new Russian government. This would be either by force, ideological belief, or economic desperation. Either way, we could potentially see Ukrainian resistance fighters also targeting them in assassinations or bombing campaigns, as they'd see them as traitors. For a while, the country would be overwhelmed by chaos. In the worst case scenario for Ukraine, Russia would seize more than half of Ukraine's territory while leaving lands west of Kyiv as a rump state. In the remains of Ukraine, a new puppet regime would be put in place by the Kremlin, which would most likely be barred from joining both NATO and the EU, while also being dragged screaming into Russia's sphere of influence. Ukraine would become depopulated as even more people would leave, and the state as we know it today would cease to exist. Initially, the West would likely refuse to recognize these new borders and Russia's legitimacy over Ukrainian territories. Sanctions would remain in place, with even more being dogpiled due to the illegal annexation made by Russia. but that wouldn't change the reality on the ground. It's likely that the situation would be similar to how the West viewed China and Taiwan throughout the 20th century with the two Chinas, one policy system. Over time, some countries might push to normalize relations with Russia, particularly if economic interests begin to outweigh political considerations. Europe's happy-go-lucky way of life would also change. With Russia expanding its borders and sphere of influence significantly via the use of force, we'd most likely see a wave of rearmament across the continent. The Baltics, Romania, and Poland would become a hotbed of new NATO military bases and hundreds of thousands of more troops securing the border. The EU's government could potentially also become more centralized due to the war exposing bureaucratic inefficiencies within its decentralized system in properly supplying Ukraine with defenses. It's possible a centralized European military force could emerge as a result. When it comes to Ukraine's economy and standard of living, things wouldn't look that great. Millions of its buildings would lie in ruin while its provinces depopulated. Russia would hire its own contractors to rebuild the nation, but considering its own resources have been severely drained and sanctions would remain in place for a while, it's uncertain how effective this would be. Furthermore, Russia is currently keeping its economy afloat due to transitioning into a war economy, but after the war ends, it's questionable if the same economic standard could be kept. We'd also definitely see Russification programs across the newly conquered territories. The Ukrainian language and identity in Russia are seen as illegitimate. Rather than as a separate culture and ethnic group, Ukrainians are viewed as a Russian subgroup. Because of the hostilities that arose from the war, we could see Russian being enforced as the official language in schools and government-led institutions. Ukrainian state and ethnic symbolism could be seen as separatist sentiment and therefore would be highly restricted. We could also see a wave of Russian settlers coming in to settle the depopulated ex-Ukrainian lands, similar in fashion to how the USSR brought ethnic Russians in its minority-led republics in an effort to displace the local population and seize control. A Russian victory would represent far more than Ukraine's defeat. It would fundamentally reshape Europe's security order. Countries along NATO's eastern flank would likely enter a decades-long military buildup, while governments around the world would reassess the value of security guarantees, alliances, and even nuclear deterrence. The war may have ended, but a new era of European geopolitics would only just be beginning. Regardless of how the war ultimately ends, one thing is certain. Ukraine will face an enormous reconstruction effort that extends far beyond rebuilding its cities and infrastructure. Reconstructing roads, homes, and power plants is relatively straightforward compared to repairing the social fabric of a nation that has endured years of large-scale war. The country's greatest challenges may prove to be psychological, economic, and demographic. One of the least discussed but potentially most significant long-term consequences is mental health. Since Russia's full-scale invasion began, Ukraine suffered well over 500,000 military casualties, including an estimated 100,000 to 140,000 fatalities. Tens of thousands of civilians have also been killed, while millions have experienced displacement, occupation, or prolonged missile attacks. Years of witnessing death, injury, torture, and destruction inevitably leave lasting psychological scars. When the fighting eventually stops, Ukraine is likely to face a mental health crisis unlike anything in its modern history. By 2023, roughly 80% of Ukrainians reported experiencing symptoms such as anxiety, depression, or sleep disorders. The World Health Organization estimates that between 10 and 15 million Ukrainians will require some form of mental health care. This figure does not fully account for veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder or family members coping with grief and long-term trauma, should Ukraine also struggle economically after the war. Unemployment and financial insecurity would likely worsen these conditions. The challenge is compounded by the region's limited mental health infrastructure. Across much of Eastern Europe, seeking psychological treatment still carries a social stigma, with many viewing therapy as a sign of shame and/or or weakness, rather than a legitimate form of healthcare. At the same time, Ukraine has a shortage of trained psychologists and psychiatrists relative to the scale of the need. Without substantial investment in treatment and rehabilitation, unresolved trauma could contribute to domestic violence, substance abuse, suicide, and cycles of generational trauma that persist long after the war has ended. Economic recovery presents another daunting obstacle. As a consequence of the war, approximately 7.1 million Ukrainians now live below the poverty line, while millions have lost their homes due to widespread destruction. Around 1 in 10 homes has been damaged or destroyed, disproportionately affecting children and the elderly. The World Bank estimates that the conflict has erased roughly 15 years of economic progress, leaving Ukraine with the difficult task of rebuilding both its infrastructure and its middle class. The economic and psychological pressures could also threaten social cohesion. History shows that veterans returning from prolonged conflicts sometimes struggle to reintegrate into civilian life. While the overwhelming majority successfully do so, those left untreated or unsupported may become vulnerable to criminal organizations or political extremism. Following the Soviet-Afghan War, for example, the Soviet veterans later became involved with organized crime during the turbulent 1990s. Ukraine will therefore need effective veteran support programs to reduce the risk of similar outcomes. The war may also leave behind deep social divisions. Millions of Ukrainians fled abroad to escape the fighting, while others remained to serve in the military or endure life under constant danger. As soldiers return home, resentment could emerge between those who fought and those who left, particularly toward military-aged men who avoided service. Although many refugees had legitimate reasons for leaving, such tensions could complicate national reconciliation and create lasting political and social fractures. The conflict has also created humanitarian issues that will outlast the battlefield. Thousands of Ukrainian children were deported or transferred to Russia or Russian-controlled territories, a practice that has become the subject of international legal proceedings. Even after a ceasefire, efforts to identify, locate, and return these children are likely to remain a contentious diplomatic and legal issue for years. Finally, Ukraine faces the challenge of rebuilding its next generation. Many children experienced years of disrupted education, first during the COVID pandemic and then because of the war. Schools were destroyed, classes moved online, and millions of students became refugees. One analysis found that during the 2022 to 2023 academic year, nearly half of Ukrainian school-aged refugee children abroad were unable to access their host countries' education systems due to administrative and logistical barriers. The educational setbacks created by these disruptions risk lowering future productivity and slowing Ukraine's long-term recovery. Ukraine's post-war future will therefore be measured by far more than territorial control or economic statistics. The country will have to rebuild its institutions, care for millions suffering from psychological trauma, reintegrate veterans and refugees, recover lost generations of students, and heal divisions created by years of war. Winning the peace may ultimately prove to be a greater challenge than winning the war itself. Hopefully, the fighting will come to an end soon in Ukraine's favor. Regardless of when that day arrives, the end of the war will mark the beginning of an equally difficult challenge. Rebuilding destroyed cities and infrastructure will require enormous financial investment, but repairing the country's economy, institutions, and social fabric will take far longer. Ukraine will have to care for millions suffering from psychological trauma, address demographic and educational setbacks, and heal the divisions left behind by years of conflict. The war's legacy will therefore be measured not only by the outcome of the battlefield, but by whether Ukraine can successfully rebuild a stable, prosperous, and united nation in the years that follow.